So welcome to this session entitled How Can Blended Finance Support the Climate Transition? There's a huge amount, as you can hear, going on around Innovation Zero today, so thanks very much for choosing us, for being here for this session. I'm Luke Cross, your moderator, and also I'm a director at Social. We help organisations, funders, non-profits, public sector organisations as well, demonstrate and communicate their sustainability, ESG and impact commitments, from stakeholder engagement right through to reporting. As a panel, we are slightly depleted today, I have to say, so apologies from Mario Fernandez, who can't be with us due to illness. Sarah Gordon has had a family emergency, so we're wishing best wishes to both of them. However, I know our remaining speakers will bring a huge amount of insight and knowledge nonetheless. So on that note, I'm delighted to introduce our panellists. To my left is Lindsey Hibberd, Senior Manager for Programmes and Innovation at the Carbon Trust. The Carbon Trust partners with businesses, governments and financial institutions worldwide to accelerate their journeys to net zero. Lindsey is a climate policy and programme delivery specialist with over 10 years of experience across the public and private sectors, and Lindsey has particular expertise in global carbon markets, where she represented the UK on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And to my right, Sam Alvis, a director covering energy and environment at policy research and strategy consultancy Public First. Public First works with global companies, governments, startups, institutions and foundations around the world to tackle major public policy and strategic challenges. Sam is an Associate Fellow of IPPR, Head of Economy at Green Alliance. Former Head of Economy at Green Alliance, and a former advisor to the Labour Party, including to Tony Blair, specifically having worked also at the Tony Blair Institute. So in terms of the format for today, so we're going to go straight into discussion and Q&A. Obviously you'll have the Slido app hopefully downloaded, or you're in the web browser. You can access it via a QR code, which is somewhere around. I'm sure it will pop up in a second if you haven't quite got that. We're going to run for about 30 minutes or so. As I say, we'd really welcome questions and interaction from the floor, so please do ping them into the app. Before I get into questions, I'm going to play the role of Sarah Gordon just for a moment. So I'm never going to be able to fill Sarah Gordon's shoes, but we had asked her to talk a bit about some research she launched a few months back, and a report called Investing in Our Future, which is practical solutions for the UK government to mobilise private investment for economic, environmental and social policy priorities. And that report really made the point that investment in the UK, both public and private, is chronically low as share of GDP compared with the country's peers. It very much positioned blended finance and what's called catalytic capital as part of the solution, and said with targeted action, the UK can address the competitive imbalance with the US and the EU on private finance mobilisation. Some of the recommendations that Sarah put into her report included the creation of a venture capital fund of funds, the UK Growth Fund, to attract pension and other large pools of institutional capital. This would aim to raise 4.6 billion at launch, rising to at least 46 billion over 5 to 10 years. It also proposed a new UK Community Growth Fund to build on successful initiatives that were set up to support small businesses, social enterprises and charities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Both funds would be managed within the existing national finance institutions established by the UK government and be overseen by a new unit to provide a centre of expertise on blended finance, hosted by HM Treasury. And they would be modelled in successful recent initiatives such as the work of the Green Investment Bank. So hopefully that gives a bit of context as to what we're talking about. But actually taking a bit of a step back from that, I suppose the first question is, what is blended finance? Why are we here talking about it? How do we define it? And what's it for? And I think I'd come to you on that, Lindsey, to kick us off, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Luke. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here. Thanks for having me. On that question specifically, I mean, I think blended finance is being kind of kicked around at the moment as kind of a new exciting thing, and I don't think it is a new thing really. For me, it's the bringing together of public and private finance that wants an investment return, and public finance that can help support de-risking that investment. So we've seen it in a lot of different places. The Carbon Trust works with government and businesses across a range of different sectors to deliver programs that can help support climate action, decarbonisation, and I'm hoping that today I can help bring kind of some examples of the different projects that we've worked on and where we've used blended finance or co-finance in an effective way to help support the acceleration of decarbonisation.
Excellent. Right, we'll come back to some of that because I definitely want to hear some examples. But Sam, to bring you in, your take on blended finance, how do you view it? What does it mean to you?
So I think we've talked about blended finance for a while now, and principally it's been used as a tool for developing economies. You're talking of multilateral development banks, ways of catch up in particularly emerging markets, and increasingly we're seeing it as a policy, a finance tool now for developed markets too, and where there is particularly high risk with, say, an objective set by government that's going to require technological innovation, it's going to require policy innovation, and a way of de-risking that aspect of innovation. But what I think is interesting is we talk about it as one concept, but really we're talking the gamut of tools here, from financial tools through to policy tools. So a grant from central government to get a project off the ground, through to something like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which was one of the ways that we financed vaccines through a series of staged philanthropic endeavours over COVID. Like, we're talking massive change in scale, massive change in targets, and I imagine we will get into this, but picking the right blended finance tool for the right objective that you're after, I think, is the conversation we need to be having now.
Yeah. So, I mean, over the years, government intervention in this way has existed, for years, right? I mean, we think about kind of public-private partnership models or whatever's come, over the years. I mean, the most current one, I suppose, is Labour's plan for a major wealth fund, which itself talks about catalytic capital by putting 7.3 billion of public money into the fund and trying to attract 22 billion pounds. But already we're getting comparisons, just to use that example, to PFI and that legacy. So how do we shape this conversation in a way that doesn't mean people immediately think, oh, okay, so you're going to put some public money in, private capital's going to come in, not take much risk, take a load of reward, and kind of rule the roost type thing?
Yeah, so Sarah's paper that you mentioned earlier is bang on that the UK is a historically low investment society, and if anyone here has met an official from the Treasury, they will know that they're not big fans of putting public capital in, and that's why we are, I think, turning to blended finance now as a way of going, okay, well, maybe we can get the private sector to pay for stuff that we want to do. We saw Blair do that with the PFI behind schools and hospitals, and now we're looking at a wider range of tools. The Labour Party has promised not just the National Wealth Fund, but a GB Energy, which is a public-owned energy generation company. We see the growth of sovereign development banks the world over at the moment. I think there's two risks. The first is we need to disaggregate what kind of tool or what kind of financial method we're talking about. So the UK, the National Wealth Fund as envisaged, is an equity investor. What Rachel Reeves has seen it as is really a tool for the state to benefit from aspects of the transition and ensure that, yes, we're de-risking some aspects of the supply chain, but the state is actually getting a revenue source as well. Then there's but on the public side, so you talk about PFI, and I spend most of my weeks in focus groups or running polls, and the public are, even more so than they used to be, very wary of this relationship with business. They are worried that business is going to pull government in business's direction and away, therefore, from the public interest. So when we're talking about blended finance tools, what I think we need to very quickly get into is how we are designing those policy interventions to encourage behaviour change from the private sector. So whether that's eligibility criteria, whether that is additionality, milestones, whatever we're talking about, but saying, actually, we're launching this policy tool, we're spending a bit of government money on X, the UK Infrastructure Bank, the National Wealth Fund, and that is going to make the private sector do this. They're interested in getting a return from it, but they're also going to be benefiting the public in X way.
Thank you. Lindsey, any views on that? I mean, particularly around the kind of political perception or public perception of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that, kind of that point, and talk about where it's kind of been used elsewhere, because we're seeing in the developing country context that, say, sustainability-linked loans are quite a useful tool in to kind of encourage broader sustainable development impact. So you can, if you have a a private, attracting private capital into a public fund and with a particular kind of percentage return. But you say if you hit particular SDG targets around leaving no one behind, about the inclusion of women, for example, then we'll reduce your interest rate from 8% to 5%. And that's a way of kind of ensuring throughout the project implementation to finish that actually that you're getting those broader benefits, and you can link those through to climate targets as well. So it's one example of where that's been quite a useful tool, and is increasingly growing as a useful tool, and we should consider this for use in the UK as well.
Yeah.
I think just sort of building on that, we have traditionally in the UK looked at grants as our principal method of public funding, partly because they're easy to get out. They're easy to design. Government is, they know what they're doing when it comes to grants. But one of the reasons we're talking about blended finance is not just because of the restricted fiscal environment means actually there might be a better way of unlocking private capital than grant making, but also it's just a smarter use of government money. So one example at the moment that I've written about recently with the Green Finance Institute is when it comes to electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for local authorities to roll out that infrastructure is predominantly a grant-based scheme, 75% of the project cost funded by central government in a grant form. Now actually, a loan guarantee from central government on that infrastructure, which we know is going to be providing a revenue, is probably a much smarter use of money, and then it allows you to go, okay, so the money that we've saved, can we put that in the consumer end instead and say we're actually creating the end demand, not just the supply at the same time?
Yeah. So, as an ex-journalist, the old sort of cynic comes out now and again, and I'm thinking, when you talk about guarantees, I'm thinking about the UK guarantee scheme that was launched over 10 years ago. Thinking about pension fund money as well, because I suppose a lot of the conversations around blended finance and kind of attracting the right sort of capital into infrastructure or other, whether that be economic or social infrastructure projects. A lot of the conversations go back to that kind of pension funds, what can pension funds do? And we had all of that conversation again under the Osborne sort of regime 10 or so years ago, and there just wasn't the appetite, to invest in new build greenfield infrastructure at the time. So what's different now, do you think?
I mean, Lindsey, feel free to come in, but I think there's a couple of things that I think are different now. One is it is incredibly clear through a series of bits of case law that investing in climate solutions is well within the fiduciary duty of pension trusts, in the way that nervousness was still around 10 years ago. And I think there's a second aspect in the development of the market, with probably the exception of offshore wind at that time, was much smaller than it is now. And if you are looking at a collection of superannuation funds looking to invest in stuff, their minimum ticket size is pretty large. Like, to put money in, they need the guaranteed returns, but it has to be of a certain size and scale, and we are hitting that on a number of different aspects of the transition now. And it's why you have, for example, this recommendation for the UK growth funds, because it allows you to pool that capital into a series of different projects, but while still maintaining the pension ticket size.
Yeah. Lindsey, did you have any?
I think what I'd say is where we're not at, though, or where we still are at, is that we don't necessarily have that really clear policy focus and intent around a lot of these sectors. And I think that the creation of the market within those sectors and financial services wanting to come, or institutions wanting to come in and wanting to come in and invest, they will invest if they see an opportunity in the market, and we can assure them that the innovations that they make now will pay off for them in the long term. And so I think the market creation in areas of housing and areas of transport will, one, support the kind of industrial decarbonisation of the UK, because there will be an incentive for our industrial sector to create those low carbon products that are going to benefit those other industries. But it will also support the investment, of these larger financial institutions that need to see that direction of travel and have that regulatory oversight in order to commit funding.
Yeah. And I guess we're seeing certain initiatives gather momentum as well. So I'm thinking about, as an example, like the place-based impact investing initiative, which is focused on initially getting local government pension fund money into local places and trying to break down more of the barriers and obstacles to that, and getting money into affordable housing, into renewables, into SMEs and those sorts of sectors or organisations. encouraging, I suppose. Are there other initiatives that you see out there like that are doing similar work?
Not that I've worked with very closely. I guess to give an example of some of the Carbon Trust's work in relation to these big sectoral transformations, and Sam mentioned offshore wind, and that's a really good example of where the Carbon Trust runs the Offshore Wind Accelerator. It started in 2008 with it's a kind of co-funded research and development program, bringing industry together to collaborate to reduce the price of offshore wind generation, and it's been successful in kind of reducing the price by 15% over the decade, really helping to bring those costs down. Where we have used blended finance as a tool within that facility is by allowing, crowding in the collaboration of the industrial players. So the forum, the offshore wind, is kind of based on membership. All of the members of the offshore wind supply chain and industry players can join. And the initiatives are very much driven by the need that is seen by them and within the market. And some of these initiatives are very expensive, and it's very expensive to look into. So by leveraging public finance through the Strategic Innovation Fund, for example, and other kind of European funding pots, we've been able to reduce the membership price of that organisation and help co-fund projects to allow all members of the offshore wind industry to collaborate together. And what that means is if you broaden the collaboration, it means that you will start converging on a direction of travel, and you will bring industry along with you at the same time, so that you can really get to this market transformation. Because one organisation can collaborate with another and do some really great work, but that is not going to kind of push the market forward, and particularly with the offshore wind market, where there's a kind of diverse range of players, and you've got to think about the networks and that kind of side of things as well. And there are some key kind of sticking issues that are preventing its expansion. Really getting everybody around the table to be able to collaborate is a very powerful tool. And so I think that's just one way where you can kind of bring together that private investment of the companies involved in the movement, but also leverage the public funding to ensure that everybody can be involved in that journey.
And I think that the reason why the offshore wind example is so powerful is because that conversation started with, we need to do electricity market reform, right? It started with this big overarching question, and then it was like, okay, so what are the barriers to electricity market reform? The rollout of renewables, first one, and specifically the high cost of renewables. And like, we went down this scale and then landed on, and therefore we need a variety of different policy interventions and blended finance tools. I think one of the problems we have at the moment with both political parties in the UK going, we need the private sector to spend it. There's a wall of private capital that is waiting to invest. And it's like, why? Like, yes, it's capital intensive, but what are you using that private capital for? Is it because there's a technology risk? Is it there's a deployment risk? Is it that there's a project and financial risk? And that gets you very quickly into, okay, so what is the public policy intervention? What is the blended finance tool that is addressing that specific form of risk? And I don't think we are having that level of granular conversation in the way that, for example, if you're in the States and you look at the Inflation Reduction Act at the moment, and in the UK we've principally focused on the massive tax credits that they've put in, but actually throughout, you would know as a business working in America that, okay, if I have a technology risk, I'm accessing this tax credit and I'm speaking to this aspect of the Department of Energy. But if I've got a deployment risk, well, I'm going to the Loans Programme Office, because actually I've proven that my technology is workable. It can, I just need to scale it, and there's still some risk in that project. What we don't have here is the clarity of, okay, well, I have this particular risk in this particular sector. Who do I turn to, and what blended finance tool am I using?
Yeah. Are we now, though, in an era of, how do I phrase this, of there being more trust between, the public sector and private capital investors? Has the move towards kind of ESG and impact, has that made a tangible difference, do you think, in terms of that potential relationship and the potential to work together?
I would say no.
Yeah.
So I think the principal way that policymakers will interact with ESG is when it comes to greenwashing. And that's not to say that all ESG is greenwashing, but you hear about the bad cases, not the good cases. There is proliferation of data, metrics, etc. It's all very confusing to a policymaker. Meanwhile, you have various different policy standards coming through in the green finance strategy, whether that is a promise of mandatory transition plans, a promise of a green taxonomy, etc. All the stuff that would underpin good governance. What we need to move to, and I think what you're seeing in some of the eligibility criteria, if you are receiving money from the European Union, if you're receiving money for the Inflation Reduction Act, seeing this from the CEFC in Australia as well, is saying we have our criteria, and they are relatively stringent on your carbon, your total emissions reductions, or like Lindsey said, your wider social objectives, your diversity, inclusion, provision of childcare, etc. That's how policymakers build trust. It's in that instrument where they know their money is being spent to achieve their objectives. It's not looking from the outside at a company that is saying the right things, and they just sort of have to trust that it is. It's proving it in the delivery of those finance mechanisms.
Yeah. And Lindsey, thoughts on that? And also, I suppose it kind of speaks to that question about, which is across the board really, around how you choose the right investment partner. What credentials you need to see. Following on from Sam's point about demonstrating in practice and delivery.
Yeah, I think the tools and how they bring people to the table is a really interesting one, because the Carbon Trust does take kind of an international view in terms of climate action, and we've been involved in coal transition and also the kind of support of the development of taxonomies, both in South Africa and Kenya. And I think taxonomy is a really interesting tool because in part it can be a blocker in some cases, and it has shown to be a blocker in terms of the investment in the transition when we're kind of specifying things as green and not making the allowance for transition fuels, or so thinking about how those tools are used and implemented in practice and what the impact you're trying to achieve at an economy level, I think is really important. The South Africa Green Finance Taxonomy is a really good example, because we supported the design and initial piloting of that, and the explicit aim was to align it with the EU taxonomy, because South Africa really wanted to ensure that there was easy kind of direct foreign investment from the EU and EU companies, and they saw that the easiest way of doing that was to align it with the EU taxonomy, so that financial institutions in the EU would have that certainty of alignment. The problem is that actually implementation in South Africa, that these institutions don't have the data and don't have the ability to meet the EU taxonomy criteria. And there is not a very limited at the moment kind of support in order to get them to that point. It's kind of you're green or you're not if you're not tough, and that's so I think we really need to think about how we bring everyone along with us on this journey and recognise that the bar in some places has been set very high, and I don't disagree with it being set high, but I think that we need to recognise that we're on a journey towards that place, and we need to push for integrity, but we also need to allow accessibility at the same time, to allow to bring everybody along on that journey with us. So I think that there are just kind of lessons learned in terms of the tools and their actual practical implementation about how we can support countries and companies to be as good as they can be in a way that really supports the broader transition and isn't just focused in on quite specific metrics.
Okay, great stuff. Okay, we've got some questions in via Slido. You can vote up the questions as well if you'd like to. There's a few here, or please do ask one or two via the QR code. If you're not on the Slido app, you can access the app there. One question that pops out for me is, how can the UK attract more private and public capital from abroad to invest into UK climate tech?
I think we'll part the politics bit, because it's sort of a little bit of stability and knowing what's going on there, I think will go miles, and we'll see what happens this year. If we're talking about overseas capital direct into the transition, I don't really see the distinction between overseas capital and UK capital. They are asking for the same things, which is it's the most fundamental and I would say boring policy ask, but it is essential, is what do you want us to do and invest in? Right, we have, in theory, a net zero strategy, but it is not aligned to our carbon budgets. It is not accompanied with an investment plan. You have a green finance strategy which is intended to contribute to the net zero strategy, and there's a circular bit of referencing, but actually their contribution to each other is incredibly unclear. We have a whole host of barriers to transition that we know, if they were moved, grid reform, planning reform, etc., would help investors invest because there would be more opportunities. So I think implementing what we've been promised, showing how it adds up to a coherent strategy and possibly our national development goal, national contribution alongside, and then moving the very obvious barriers out of the way and waiting for business and investors to say, okay, well, here's the next set of barriers now you've done those really obvious ones that we're facing.
Yeah, I think it is as simple as Sam says, kind of, investors want to return and they want to ensure that that they will invest if there is a good proposition to invest, and so we just need to ensure that we have the structures in place throughout the market that encourages that investment at every opportunity. Kind of, we're dealing with a lot of multinational, cross-border financial institutions within the UK anyway, so they've already got that global portfolio, and they'll look to where looks most attractive in terms of putting that capital. So I think we can create the financial structures to do that, but we need to show that direction of travel very clearly. Just on a really small point around that, on using the offshore wind example again, on innovation, one of the problems that we found is that actually grant funding programs tend to be at a national level. They're very nationalistic, whereas actually the offshore wind sector is a very European sector, and a lot of the projects done in collaboration are done in collaboration across Europe. And generally you're having to tap into UK innovation funding just for the UK part of that project, and everybody else is going to have to go out to their own sectors because they're not keen to welcome broader applicants from outside the UK. So I think thinking about how we can use those pots more flexibly to attract business from elsewhere would be helpful as well.
Okay, another question. How could blended finance be a solution to the grids issue, given the high capital required and proximity to government-regulated entities and policy?
So one very specific example that I know the Labour Party is currently exploring, whether it's through GB Energy, the promise for an energy generation company, or through the National Wealth Fund. The destination is not entirely clear. But so investing in the actual build-out of infrastructure is one thing. Having the supply chain sorted and the procurement sorted is another. And I think government focusing on that aspect in the first instance. So you see TenneT, the Dutch-German energy conglomerate that builds transmission infrastructure but is a publicly owned Dutch company, for example, aligns technical standards with the other TOs. It pursues a joint procurement exercise to reduce the price, but also give suppliers, whether it's Hitachi, whoever, a guaranteed foresight of the order book that's coming in. We don't really have that process in the UK. We certainly don't have alignment of technical standards. So focusing there on the first instance, I think sorting out the procurement, the supply chain, ideally having an idea of how much grid you need to build out, whether that's by 2030, 2035. I know NESO, National Grid, working very, very hard on that, but it's not entirely clear that the demand is absolutely critical to stimulating the supply. And then if investors know that bit's sorted, then we can talk about investing in the rollout.
I think it depends what you mean by private capital as well, because it's obviously the investment of the industry themselves. So nobody's going to invest in the industry. If you look at the sector and they're not doing it themselves, you think, well, why do we do it instead? So it is potentially using that kind of accelerator approach to crowd in the collaboration of the industry, because there are so many players when it comes to grid and so many different opinions and understanding that needs to align in order to drive towards kind of a common outcome. That I think using private capital of the industry themselves, backed with public funding, to help support that collaboration and generation of ideas and acceleration of options, and then if you're looking to attract other private capital, either from financial institutions or from business, just having a very clear mechanism by which to do that with a clear aim and objective.
Okay. There's a question here potentially related. How can blended finance achieve better private leverage in smaller scale and decentralised projects such as mini grids, not necessarily UK?
So we work a lot. We've got a Transforming Energy Access programme that we run for the UK Foreign FCDO, I can never remember what it's now called, and also which has a component of focusing on mini grids. I think that historically in that context, there's been a use of guarantees, and we haven't actually found that that's worked particularly well. There's a kind of a big review going on at the moment about whether that does actually work and whether that incentivizes long-term action in that sector. I think we found that once programs have been removed, those banks just stop lending, and so actually you're not creating that longevity and embedding those kind of processes and that structure within the within the country. Sorry. So I think increasingly, as I mentioned before, kind of sustainability-linked loans, but again, bringing the supply chain together, bringing the project developers together towards kind of innovation pots or structures that they can use to tap into the right kind of finance at the right time that will support them with what they're looking to do.
Sam, anything to add?
I was just going to say more generally, I think I've said this point a few times, but objective first, tools second. And the key thing about different blended finance tools is from the outset, they each have different potential leverage ratios, whether that's a grant, whether it's tax credit, whether it's a sustainability-linked loan. So if you're trying to increase the leverage ratio of a particular tool, it's tricky, but you might be talking about when you transition to the next tool, depending on the development of the market.
Okay. Another one here which has got a few votes. What are the key challenges for applying blended finance in emerging markets with high interest rate environments?
It's well outside my area of expertise.
Okay. We'll leave it. Popular question. We'll leave that one. Maybe we can send it over to Sarah or Mario for an email response at some point. One about carbon emissions cap and trade. We're supposed to let the market provide the solutions. Does the panel think cap and trade has failed?
There is an excellent book on this by Cullingwood and Victor, which called Making Climate Policy Work, which I would encourage you all to read. And has cap and trade failed? It depends on who you ask, which is the classic politicians get out answer. It is a contributing factor to emissions reductions in the order of about 20%. It is not the silver bullet. The West American scheme, for example, is working well. The EU scheme is like the light on the hill. It is excellent, the carbon pricing they do there. I think you've actually seen the impacts of the UK leaving that scheme have been quite pronounced. We're about to be threatened with a carbon barter adjustment mechanism. One of the ways around that would be to link the emissions trading system. But fundamentally, that's going to be very hard because as soon as we left the EU, we started playing with our climate policy, did a few other things. Our carbon price dropped through the floor. So actually reconciling those two prices now is going to be very challenging. I think that shows you that the EU one is working well. Small, volatile, politically uncertain markets, of which the UK now falls in, they work less well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that setting a carbon price is one of the key ways that you have to, in order kind of to set that long-term trajectory and that incentive for investment. And obviously the ETS and a progressive carbon tax are two ways of doing that. I think we're entering quite an interesting phase with the EU ETS as well. That to date, it's incentivized. Obviously, it covers the energy sector and heavy industrial sector, and the energy sector in the EU has rapidly decarbonised over the last few years. And previously, that was the sector that was really driving the price. So through kind of hedging of the market, and they were the ones that were really determining that price. And the industrial sector hasn't really stepped in yet to kind of fill that void, and won't step in the same way. So it's likely that we could see a lot more speculation in the market, and it will just be interesting to to see how that kind of reconciles when actually the focus now is on using that carbon price to decarbonise industrial energy intensives. But ETSs take a long time to set up. I think that's the other thing that you really need to think about if you're going to roll it out in lots of different countries, and lots of countries have signalled that they want to do it, but it's years in terms of piloting and going through those phases, and it doesn't work very well if you've got an administration that changes and puts it on pause for another couple of years. So I think in terms of the time pressure, the very, very real time pressure that we're working with, you really need to think about, again, as Sam says, what your aims and objectives are, and if that is the right tool that's going to achieve your aims and objectives in the quickest possible way.
Okay, fantastic. I said we'll talk for 30 minutes. You guys have done an amazing job going longer than that, fielding all those questions, so thank you so much. My very last one, just a final message probably from both of you, just to wrap up on the role of blended finance, just to reiterate that point, the role of blended finance going forward.
Yeah, so I wrote a paper on this recently with think tank IPPR and Green Finance Institute, which is the role of finance in industrial strategy. And we've seen industrial policy is really making a comeback in markets across the world, and I don't think finance has quite woken up to what that means. My fundamental message is that an industrial strategy sets the direction of what you want to do, and then that scatters down into therefore what each sector needs to do to contribute to that overall goal. There will be a blended finance tool for each of those sectors, but until you have that essay question, we don't know how we can apply blended finance.
Great, thank you, Sam. Lindsey?
And I think with that kind of overarching policy structure is obviously very important, but we know we have the tools, we have the mechanisms. This isn't anything new. We have the ability to do it. We just need to kind of lower our risk appetite, raise our risk appetite, most importantly, and just get on and do it. Yeah,
there was a moment there as the music came on. It was very dramatic. It was going to like, here's this lovely end message, rousing, exactly. Call to action, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sam and Lindsey. Thanks everyone for listening, and if we could give the speakers a round of applause, that would be appreciated.